Hi, my name is Alan Yu, a program manager for Microsoft. Today, I am very excited to share with you everything we learned from introducing Jupyter Notebooks to the SQL community. These are people who are typically not Jupyter Notebook users, so it's very exciting to share the learnings from introducing notebooks to this community. To quickly start off, I work on the SQL Server Tools team. At the beginning, we were mostly a Windows and closed source tooling team working on tools like SQL Server Management Studio. But over time, it was important for us to listen to where our users were, including that more and more of our users were starting to use different operating systems, and as well as starting to lean more towards open source. So for us as a team, we started to evolve and try to understand what does it mean to build experiences available on any platform while also embracing open source collaboration. And this led to the creation of Azure Data Studio, which is a cross-platform tool, is also available on GitHub, and is also a fork of Visual Studio Code, which is a very popular open source project. And Azure Data Studio is all about being a tool for all data personas, especially for our database administrators and database developers, who we are very familiar with, while also we're supporting Azure SQL and SQL Server, but we also want to be supporting additional relational engines like MySQL and PostgreSQL as well. So in addition to supporting our existing personas and as well as our kind of domain areas, we really wanted to embrace the idea of embracing this tool for all data personas. And over time, we realized that we needed to have an experience for our data engineers and data scientists of the world who are looking for experiences like Spark, which we have included through some of our feature offerings. But really, it was important for us to think about, in order to support data scientists, we had to think about how do we bring Jupyter Notebooks supported inside of Azure Data Studio. And as we embarked into this journey, we needed to set some principles so that we weren't going and reinventing the wheel all the time. So this included leveraging open source as much as possible and really working with the open source community if something was really missing. We also wanted to optimize for backwards compatibility with existing Jupyter viewers, which there are many out there in the community. And then finally, we also wanted to, as part of this process of learning and listening, we're all about doing a crawl, walk, run approach, where basically it means we're okay with iterating quickly and shipping preview experiences so that we could get quick feedback loops so that we could create beautiful North Stars incrementally. And so through this effort, we ended up creating notebooks that were really great for our data engineers and data scientists, and we only supported the Python kernel at the time. However, as we brought this experience into Azure Data Studio, the DBAs, or the database administrators, they actually were very curious about it, and they said they even liked the interface. However, they still ran into a few issues when they tried it out for the first time, and they all really wished for the same thing, which was to have a SQL kernel that kind of brings all the things that they are looking for. And it turns from an experience that they really like into something that they would really love. And so we decided that we wanted to go listen to these DBAs and kind of bring them on the journey about what does it mean to bring notebooks to relational DBAs. And then while on this journey of going through various focus groups and research studies, user calls, and also looking through our GitHub issues, we also want to validate these across the existing Jupyter open source community, which we have done through including them in our research studies, for example. It was kind of from these experiences that we had a few lessons that we kind of took away from just listening and learning. And the first lesson that I want to share with you is that SQL users have high expectations for familiar experiences. And a very common bar that they're always comparing our experiences with is from a query editor. They need the code cells to behave just like it, whether it means syntax highlighting or IntelliSense, or even performance. They really needed to have that kind of familiarity, and they would always be comparing to what they are have been using basically 90% of their day-to-day work is spent inside of a query editor. Another adoption blocker is around they just don't have time to learn Python. So they really need to have initial experience that doesn't necessarily have a high dependency on Python while kind of trying out notebooks for the first time. And so as we kind of experimented and looked at what does it mean to bring a dedicated SQL kernel, we did show them SQL Magics before, but it just did not really vibe with them due to the dependency on still having to learn Python. But we still want to set some principles around this too, because we eventually do want to contribute any of this work back to open source community. So for sure, we would want to make sure that we stick with the Jupyter messaging protocol for consistency of experiences across different viewers. In addition, we want to make sure that our SQL Notebook implementation just works right out of the box when someone downloads Azure Data Studio, which is the expectation when someone downloads SQL Server Management Studio or Azure Data Studio, they can just start querying right away. And we want a notebook to be just as good as a built-in query editor inside of the tool. In addition, we wanted to support any of our tool services like SQL Tool Service, which we created and contributed to open source for. But this would also allow us to not be bound to being language specific. So we would be able to support MS SQL, Postgres, as well as MySQL. And then at the end of it, we also want to make sure we leverage the common .ipynb format so that we're not breaking any of that open source promise. And so now we look at our query editor. This is what the query editor looks like inside of Azure Data Studio and what the majority of our DBAs are used to. As you can see, they have IntelliSense and syntax highlighting, as well as a dedicated results grid where they can go copy and export all this data that they need. And so when we designed for the SQL notebook, this is kind of what the experience looks like, in that each of these code cells in a SQL kernel, as you can see right here, is basically leveraging the VS Code editor. So the exact same experience that you saw from before with the IntelliSense and syntax highlighting and the results grid, we're using the exact same APIs for each of our code cells. So you can almost think of each of the code cells as mini VS Code editors. In addition, another key part of these SQL customers, obviously, is they will need to have a connection to a database. And so we did add this drop-down menu here so that users can use our existing connection dialog to then connect to their SQL connection of choice. And so if you can see that was kind of represented this GIF, this represents all the basic experience that a DBA would need to start using a notebook. Lesson number 2 that I want to talk about was that SQL users would really benefit from getting additional getting started experiences, and especially around Python dependency management as they want to start exploring it to try things like a PowerShell kernel, or just, writing text cells for the first time with Markdown. And so we started this endeavor with the Python dependencies management. The one on the left is kind of this dedicated GUI that we created so that if someone were to switch away from the SQL kernel, which is the default experience, to something like Python or PowerShell or PySpark, this would tell exactly the user as what version of Python they're using, whether it's one that we're shipping or if it's something that they already have installed on their machine. And then we'll transparently show all the dependencies that get installed for each kernel. And in addition, we also provide a manage packages option so they could see what packages they currently have. They could easily add a new one and all the version numbers. And it's these kind of things that we also validated through a user study that would really be beneficial if there was better ways in our Jupyter Notebooks ecosystem to manage these very confusing Python dependencies. And over time, we also did a bunch of improvements around Markdown, and that a lot of the users weren't comfortable with Markdown syntax for the first time. They're much more used to rich text for the most part. And so we kind of started out with this crawl, walk, run approach that I mentioned earlier, where we originally just supported Markdown. Then we added a Markdown toolbar with common actions like bold, italicize, and highlight. But eventually we took it to this North Star experience due to this constant feedback loop with our customers, where they told us, we want to keep seeing this experience evolve. And through leveraging open source, we were able to have this rich text mode where you can see that we're writing in rich text, and then it converts it behind the scenes to Markdown for you. And an additional benefit from this work is that we're also supporting various pasting options. So let's say that the user had a documentation page that's really popular with them. This is an example for Microsoft Docs. Or if they have like a OneNote that they might have, or PowerPoint even, and that they wanted to start using that content to start filling out their notebooks, which would really help them to start adding it to their workflows. And now by having this kind of experience that we worked with customers to build, now they can just create these notebooks so quickly while converting to Markdown for them. And then kind of lesson number 3 here, that SQL users immediately understand notebooks for documentation as well as for collaboration. And you can see that across these different work streams that are very immediately clear to notebook ecosystem, documentation and collaboration is the ones that SQL customers have completely understand. They embraced Jupyter Books as soon as we shipped this feature, and kind of worked with the Jupyter Books maintainers to build this experience in the tool. And already we're seeing scenarios like troubleshooting, training, demos, tutorials, and samples really catch on with the SQL community. And as well as we added the option to create a Azure Data Studio or VS Code extension to ship this Jupyter book. So in summary, we're always trying to think of how do we take these learnings to help other new users to love notebooks, not just SQL users, but anyone else in the Jupyter community or outside the Jupyter community. And so some takeaways here is to talk to new users and ask for their pain points, identify low-hanging fruit, and work with the community to improve this experience through features or documentation, and try and see what clicks with new users. And then soon, by really putting this effort to go listen and learn from our customers, everyone will learn to love notebooks. So to learn more about Azure Data Studio, check out our project on GitHub. And thank you so much for your time.